This case isn't about attraction or infamy. It's about how power and control can turn intimacy into something lethal. Welcome to Something with Rum. I'm Charlene, where we explore the dark side to the human mind. Bernardo and Karla Homolka became widely known as the Barbie and Ken killers, a media label that focused primarily on their appearance rather than the reality of their crimes. While the nickname gained a lot of media attention, it also softened the perception of the extreme violence and shifted focus away from power, coercion, and harm. This case isn't going to be looked at through this lens here. This video is going to look at the psychological dynamics between Bernardo and Homolka, how dominance, dependency, and complicity developed within their relationship, and how those dynamics contributed to the escalating violence. Bernardo was born the 27th of August 1964 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. On the surface, his early life looked relatively stable. However, from a psychological perspective, his development was shaped by instability, unresolved insecurity, and a growing need to assert control. These factors would later become a central part to his offending. A significant disruption occurred when Bernardo discovered that the man he believed to be his biological father was in fact not his real father. This revelation fractured that sense of identity at a formative stage. Identity instability during childhood or adolescence can create a persistent sense of inadequacy, more so when emotional processing and support are limited. Rather than integrating this experience in a healthy way, Bernardo appeared to internalize it as shame. As he moved through adolescence, this underlying insecurity manifested as overcompensation. Bernardo began to form a sense of intellectual superiority, positioning himself above others as a way of defending himself against feelings of inadequacy. This defensive grandiosity is quite common in people with fragile self-esteem. Dominance becomes a way to feel whole. Bernardo's difficulties with peer and romantic relationships further reinforced this pattern. He struggled with rejection, particularly from women, and he interpreted these experiences as a personal humiliation rather than a mutual incompatibility. Instead of a little bit of self-reflection, he externalized that blame. Over time, the repeated rejection paired with entitlement created resentment. This gradually hardened into rigid beliefs about power and gender. Women in Bernardo's mind became symbolic of judgment and denial. Psychologically, this is a critical shift. When others are perceived not as individuals, but as obstacles to self-worth, empathy begins to erode. Gendered resentment replaced relational understanding. Cultural narratives surrounding masculinity also played a role. Bernardo absorbed some distorted ideas relating dominance, sex, and control with male value. These beliefs, combined with his insecurities, led him to view sex as something that he was owed, rather than mutually negotiated. In this framework, consent became secondary to entitlement. As his sexuality developed, these beliefs fused with arousal. Exposure to violent and degrading sexual material reinforced the association between control and gratification. Through this associative learning, sexual arousal became linked not to intimacy, but to humiliation, fear, and dominance. This process laid the psychological foundation for sexual sadism. This is where suffering of others becomes integral to pleasure. By adulthood, Bernardo's entitlement, insecurity, resentment, and sexualization had merged into one single psychological system. Violence didn't merely express anger, it functioned as a mechanism for restoring threatened self-worth and asserting superiority. Each act reinforced his internal narrative of dominance and justification, further distancing him from empathy and accountability. It's important to note that these patterns were already established before he entered the relationship with Karla Homolka. The relationship would just provide opportunity and reinforcement. Karla Homolka was born 4th May 1970 in Port Credit, Ontario, Canada. Compared to Bernardo, her early life appeared more stable, but psychologically it was marked by emotional distance, inconsistency, and a lack of secure attachments. While there is no evidence of any abuse in her upbringing, the emotional environment she grew up in played a significant role in shaping her need for approval and fear of abandonment. From a young age, Homolka displayed a strong desire to be liked, chosen, and valued. When emotional validation is inconsistent or limited during childhood, individuals may learn to seek self-worth externally rather than develop a stable internal sense of self. In Homolka's case, affection and attention became closely tied to identity. Being wanted equated to being worthy. This intensified during her adolescence. Homolka placed significant importance on romantic relationships and being perceived as desirable. Her self-esteem became increasingly dependent on how she was perceived by others, more so by male partners. Rather than forming identity through autonomy or self-definition, she orientated herself around attachment. When Homolka met Bernardo as a teenager, the relationship quickly became central to her sense of self. Bernardo's confidence and dominance initially offered what felt like security and belonging. However, this dynamic soon shifted into one categorized by control, intimidation, and abuse. Bernardo's approval was conditional, often withdrawn and re-granted in cycles that reinforced dependence. Psychologically, this dynamic aligns with trauma bonding. Trauma bonds form when periods of fear or harm are intermittently paired with affection or validation. Over time, the nervous system becomes conditioned to associate survival and safety with the abuser. In such a dynamic, compliance is not simply obedience. It becomes a strategy to maintain physical and emotional security. However, it is important to state that Homolka was an adult during these crimes and should retain accountability. What occurred here was a gradual erosion of moral boundaries. As Homolka's identity became increasingly tied to the relationship, maintaining Bernardo's approval took precedence over empathy, judgment, and self-protection. Her participation didn't emerge suddenly. It developed through desensitization, rationalization, and moral disengagement. Each act crossed a new boundary, making the next one easier to justify. Homolka's actions also reflect a desire to secure her position within the relationship. Participation became a way of proving her loyalty and her value, a way to ensure that she was not discarded or replaced. In this sense, the violence functioned as a way to prove her devotion and belonging in the relationship. By the time the crimes escalated, Homolka was no longer acting out of fear or submission. She was an active participant. Her vulnerability helps explain how she became involved, but it does not absolve her of accountability for the choices that she made. Psychologically, Homolka's case illustrates how attachment needs, identity fragility, and coercive control can converge, allowing an individual to commit acts that contradict their earlier values. The dynamic between Bernardo and Homolka was defined by inequality. This was not a partnership of equals, nor a shared delusion that formed simultaneously. Bernardo was the ideological and psychological driver. Homolka just became the enabler, shaped by coercion, fear, and a growing need to prove herself. This pattern can be described as coercive control, where dominance is maintained not only through violence, but through emotional manipulation, isolation, and conditional affection. As the relationship progressed, participation became a form of survival and belonging. Each act further bound Homolka to Bernardo, reducing the psychological distance between victimization and perpetration. The complicity did not occur in a single moment. It developed through gradual moral disengagement. What emerged was a relationship in which violence was normalized, secrecy reinforced loyalty, and accountability dissolved in the private little world that they had created. Between 1990 and 1992, Bernardo and Homolka were responsible for a series of sexual assaults and murders, primarily targeting young girls. The victims were Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French. Tammy Homolka, Karla's sister, was the first known victim. She was just 15 years old at the time of her death in 1990. Prior to this occurring, Paul Bernardo had expressed to Karla that he wanted Tammy, framing the desire in terms of control and possession rather than attraction. This disclosure is significant psychologically as it demonstrates how early on Bernardo began to test boundaries within the relationship and how Homolka's loyalty to him would soon override familial protection. Tammy's death occurred within the family home and it marked a critical escalation. From a psychological standpoint, this event reflects a complete collapse of moral and relational boundaries. The targeting of a sibling underscores how deeply the relationship dynamic had already shifted, with allegiance to Bernardo overriding empathy and instinctive safeguards. It also set a precedent within the relationship, reinforcing secrecy, shared culpability, and the normalization of harm. In 1991, Leslie Mahaffey, aged just 14 years old, was abducted after missing her curfew and being locked out of her home. Leslie was held for an extended period of time before being killed. This event reflects an escalation, the prolonged confinement, increased planning, and a growing sense of entitlement. The duration of Leslie's captivity suggests that control itself had become central to the violence, not merely an accompanying factor. The final known victim, Kristen French, was just 15 years old when she was abducted in 1992. Her kidnapping occurred in a public space, indicating an increased confidence. Kristen was held for several days before being killed. By this stage, the crimes showed a clear pattern of rehearsal and repetition, suggesting that violence had fully become normalized within the relationship. Each crime followed patterns of manipulation, confinement, and control. The acts were recorded, revisited, and discussed between the couple, reinforcing that psychological loop between the pair. Victims were chosen for their vulnerability, and the crimes were marked by planning rather than spontaneity. From a psychological standpoint, the crimes reflect Bernardo's need for dominance and sadistic gratification, alongside Homolka's increasing participation and moral collapse. The progression of these crimes demonstrates how violence can escalate when power dynamics go unchecked, boundaries are repeatedly crossed, and accountability is diffused within an intimate relationship. The legal aftermath of the crimes committed by the couple remains one of the most controversial in Canadian criminal history. While the courts did deliver sentences, many questions surrounding responsibility and justice were left unanswered. The death of Tammy Homolka was initially ruled as an accidental overdose in December of 1990. At the time, authorities were provided with a consistent account by Bernardo and Homolka that framed Tammy's death as an unintended medical emergency. There were no obvious external injuries, no witnesses beyond the couple, and no physical evidence to contradict their version of events. As a result, the case was closed without a criminal investigation. It was only years later, during the investigation into the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, that the broader dynamics of the relationship came under scrutiny. While no charges were ever brought in connection with Tammy's death, her case would later be understood as the first clear collapse of moral boundaries, a turning point that set the precedent for what was to come. In 1993, Karla Homolka entered into a plea deal with the prosecution in exchange for her testimony against Paul Bernardo. She pleaded guilty on 2 counts of manslaughter for the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. Tammy's death was not included in the agreement. At the time the deal was made, prosecutors believed Homolka's involvement to be limited and accepted the portrayal of her as coerced and an abused partner. Homolka was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison. The plea agreement was finalised before investigators discovered a series of videotapes recorded by Paul Bernardo. These later revealed Homolka's active participation in the assaults and the murders. These recordings fundamentally altered the public's understanding of her role. However, because the agreement was legally binding, it could not be overturned. Paul Bernardo's trial followed in 1995. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, as well as multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault and related offences. The court identified Bernardo as the primary psychological and operational driver of the crimes, citing clear evidence of planning, intent, and sustained control. Bernardo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. His sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and the ongoing and extreme risk he posed to the public. The disparity between the outcomes for the two provoked widespread outrage and continues to fuel debate. Psychologically, the case forces some difficult questions. How should coercion be weighed against participation? At what point does victimization give way to accountability? And what happens when critical evidence emerges too late to alter legal decisions? Homolka was released in 2005 after serving her full sentence. This moment reignited public anger and underlined the enduring impact of unresolved justice, in this case for Tammy Homolka, whose death was never addressed in court. Legal resolution does not always equate to moral or psychological closure. It illustrates how power, coercion, and complicity can intersect within intimate relationships, and how the consequences of those dynamics can extend far beyond the courtroom.